Welcome to Standing Up. Gina Misra, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So you are the founder of SciWorthy, a science information website. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you
Yep.
tell me more about that?
Yeah. So SciWorthy is nominally like a science news site in that we cover things that are recent. So we cover all studies published within the last 2 years of whenever the day is that we are publishing it. So there's kind of a rolling window if you were to scroll back through all of our articles. But the differences kind of end there. And I guess the main difference is that we don't use the journalistic writing style. So the articles are not structured where there's this who, what, where, when, why lead sentence at the beginning. And then everything else in the article is of decreasing importance with quotations from experts. So that's sort of how news writing works. And that is, what your opinion is about how adequate that style of writing is aside, I have decided that the public needs an alternative to that to learn about science, because that style of writing does kind of gloss over some of the meatier aspects of science, like how it was really done and how the experiments were set up and how the scientists came upon their conclusion. And then the other side of this is that since we don't interview sources and we don't try to create a story around the science, we're actually just translating the paper as it is, in like the most objective, unbiased way that we possibly can, so that non-scientists have as close as possible access to the primary literature as a scientist would. But if you've ever tried to look up journal articles yourself, like the original research, it's either behind a paywall or
It's
written in
impossible to
this really,
understand.
yeah, technical language that it's
Right.
not like the public is stupid. It's that you're just not an expert in that field, and all that jargon is used to just communicate efficiently between all the people in that field. So what we do at SciWorthy is we just take those papers and then write them in language that people can understand, and outside that discipline. So we even have other scientists read
Mm.
SciWorthy because it's a way to learn about other fields in a way that you might not be able to otherwise.
Okay, well, you just got a new user, myself.
Yay.
That is something that is so well needed. I truly think one of the biggest problems people have today is that we don't have an easy method to know what's true or what's not. There's so much misinformation out there. And to get to the
Mhm.
bottom of it, it takes a level of research that most people, A, aren't willing to do. And even if they would be willing to do, it's not always accessible. And I'm gonna acknowledge this about myself. I once decided I'm gonna get to the bottom of vaccines. Lots of claims about vaccines. Do they cause autism? Are they harmful? I heard that there's like a vaccine court, all these claims. I did
Yeah.
a few hours of research and did not get any closer because I could not understand what the studies actually said because I'm not a scientist. So this is a huge problem. So I think what you're doing is very much needed. Um, that makes me so excited to hear. So is it is there specific things that you specific types of science that you focus on? Like, is it things that are contested politically, or is it just across the board? You're going to address any type of science and simplify it for people.
Yeah, there's a few things. We actually it's this process has been developing over a long period of time as how we choose what to cover, because that is a way to introduce bias. So I'm very mindful of, how we decide what to cover. So if it's we I actually have developed, and I love making flowcharts because I'm a nerd and I enjoy like flowcharts and spreadsheets and things like that. So I built this flowchart that says, okay, so if it's a politicized topic, here's how to decide. And so there's a bunch of like, is it this, is it that? And then on the other side, is it not a politicized topic? What are some of the criteria that I would look at?
Hmm.
So I can post that graphic if you're interested in that. But I think what in the short of it is, if it's a non-politicized topic, we try to go for either the big results that, where it's like a big finding, where, a lot of scientific studies are kind of mundane. They are like incremental findings, technical papers that are about like, oh, we innovated like a new way to run this kind of experiment. So the most people are going to be like, yawn, like, tell me when you find out something cool with that. So if it's one of those studies where it's like a big result, then we try to cover it, especially if it's something people are talking about and if it's really relevant to our audience's interests. I can talk more about who our audience is, or in my mind, who I want them to be, later on, I suppose. But the if it's a small result or kind of a middle of the road result, there's a bunch of different ways that we go about it. So on the site, we
What's an
have,
example of a small result?
yeah, that's a good question. So if it's a small result, it's something like like my graduate research, for example. So I did my research on produce food safety. So I have a master's in molecular biology, and so I did my thesis on this thing where I infected, that's not the right word. I contaminated hydroponic growing media with bacteria that are usually associated with foodborne illness, and measured sort of over a growing period if the levels increased or not. And so I did find that there was a small difference in bacterial survival over 10 days on different growing media materials. And so this is like not a change the world kind of paper. I'm not deluded in thinking of like my own importance in that way, but it's an interesting result.
Okay.
Mostly to food scientists, mostly to food safety people, but maybe some microgreen growers too, which is the crop that I studied.
Small
So
would just
small, yeah, like
okay.
it's an incremental finding that maybe helps the science along, but it doesn't have large meaning for like a broad swath of people. And it's not a major finding in the field. It's kind of just like a
Okay, I
step,
understand.
a lot of that was expected. And we had a hypothesis that probably there would be a difference, and it turned out that there was, but it was small. So that's like a small to medium result. It was interesting and it got published, so that kind of thing. But for like a big result, I guess it would be something like, I mean, I follow a lot of the COVID-19 literature. So there's big results or things like, oh, we find out that, so there's this Chinese study that I haven't really gotten a chance to get into yet, where they measured the virus levels in 10 million people in China, which is a ridiculous amount of work. If you've ever done that kind of work, it almost seems not believable that they did that. But 10 million people, and found that asymptomatic spread occurred in such a small rate of the population. So I want to look into that more to find out if that's really what it said or not, but it did make its rounds in the news. So that's another kind of thing, is if something is like really making its way through the news, and either people are getting it wrong or they're explaining only certain parts of it, and we feel like Cyworthy's approach can add something to the discussion, then we will cover that. So, and we try to be even-handed with like, okay, we cover evolution and climate change, but we'll cover things like microaggressions. There's an article on there about that. And so we try to be even-handed with the topics that we cover. And if you read the study, you want to not assume Cyworthy agrees or disagrees with the study or its authors. We're just presenting what the authors say about it. So you could read it and say, oh, this study's crap, but at least you know now that why you believe the study is crap. So does that make sense?
Interesting. So but do you yourself assess if you think this study isn't worthy of being published, or as long as it's been peer reviewed and it's
Yes,
that for you is enough to then simplify?
Yeah, it has to be peer reviewed. So there are a lot of studies we get recommended that are on preprint servers that haven't been accepted yet. So we don't cover those, and we don't cover government reports. So there was this sort of CDC report that was making its rounds on both sides of the news, and we didn't cover that because it was actually an internal CDC publication. It wasn't actually offered up to the scientific community for comment. So that's how we decide. So it has to be accepted to a peer-reviewed journal. I do make some like case by case decisions. So for example, there are a lot of people that will just invent a journal and then have their friends review it. And then I had this happen where there was this professor that kind of wanted to further their idea, but it was in this super obscure journal and the peer review took like 3 days, which is ridiculous. So I didn't accept that study mainly because he didn't follow my instructions for how I want people to cover stuff. But I also had some reservations about the reputability of the study just because it looked like it came from a made up journal. So I do sometimes have to make some decisions like that, which kind of make me uncomfortable because I realize that's an introduction of bias, but I also do want to make sure that enough members of the scientific community have looked at it in that discipline, because I'm not an expert in everything. So I'm not qualified to actually say, oh, is this a good study or not in mathematics? Like I have no
Right.
background in that. So there's some element of trust involved in this. So
Are there topics that you won't publish because they're just controversial, extremely controversial?
So I had a thought about this because I remember back 2 years ago, there was a paper that was about the transgender phenomenon in teenage girls. And
Right, I've heard about that.
that was like radioactive. And so I had to make a decision back then when the site was kind of new still, and I was a little new to the editor thing and I wasn't sure how to handle it. So we did choose not to cover that mainly because covering it at all would be taking a position in that fight. And so that was because I have writers on my team who are on the left end of the political spectrum and on the right end. I didn't want to make a decision for the whole group um, that wasn't going to benefit them. Like, so just, I don't know if that makes sense. Like, I'm okay with throwing myself on the free speech altar, but I don't want to make that decision for someone else. So we had a kind of a group agreement that we weren't going to cover it, but that we were going to reevaluate the situation in 6 months to see if it's still so polarized and radioactive that we could cover it. And it wouldn't even be taking a position on it. That I think is what's so frustrating about this, is that if I covered it, it would be to explain what was done so that readers on all sides of the aisle would be able to say, oh, is that actually a good way to do that? I don't know. I don't think so. Or like, oh yeah, that's totally legit. I don't have any, I'm agnostic to what people's reactions are. I think that's kind of the important part of this is I trust the public to make up their own minds about the data. I just want to be able to present it so that they can
Right.
do that.
So that's interesting. So there could essentially be a situation where things are too polarizing, and then it's not that you have an issue with it, but you're looking out for your staff. And hmm, are you worried that that will create a situation in the future? Because it seems like, as we progress, there are more scientific concepts that are becoming also political issues, which is
Yeah, we don't shy away from politicized science. We could definitely have covered plenty of stuff about climate change and evolution, and even that microaggressions paper that I had covered, where the author actually was calling into question whether that is a valid concept. So it definitely was polarizing for sure. But I wanted to be able to put it out there so people could see it.
mm,
I think I also though don't want to give the impression that I have a dog in the fight. So
right.
I don't cover things that everyone's yelling at each other about because emotions are high and I am not trying to ride the anxiety wave.
I get
That's
what
kind
you're
of
saying.
another part of the mission, is that I think the way that information is reported these days, it's almost like the news sites and other sites kind of benefit from people's polarization and anxiety and
For
stress.
sure.
And I am trying to actively avoid riding those
Okay.
waves. So in 6 months, in another 6 months, in 2 years, maybe I'll cover the Lisa Littman paper because it won't be something people are mudslinging about anymore, and then it'll be out there. So
Right, right.
that's sort of how I've balanced it. It's not ideal, but I really just don't want to get into the fight on the internet. That's like a
I hear
big,
that. I hear that.
yeah.
On the other hand, it might help the website get views if you touch on these controversial ones. And it could go back and forth. So you'll publish something controversial, and then people will be like, "Oh, that's an alt-right publication."
Yeah,
And then the next month you'll publish something and be like, oh, they're so woke, look what they're publishing. So
right. And
yeah,
I don't want in on that. Like I'm fine with having less traffic if I'm not fanning those flames, because I
I
think
hear
that's
you.
super unhealthy. And it really, science isn't political. It shouldn't be. It gets
Hmm.
that way because of the flawed human beings that do science. But
Right.
the scientific method is intentionally uh, designed to be objective in the sense that we can be objective. So,
Okay. So I would say that's good, and it's coming from a place of preserving human well-being, not some internal bias. Would
and I mean, yeah, if there's any bias, it's my bias against provoking anxiety in the
right,
population. I
right.
have anxiety and I'm fairly open about my mental health. And so I feel like personally, when I read things online, I can feel my blood pressure going up, and it's just not, I don't think that's a healthy, that clouds your thinking. That is a
Right.
problem in the daily lives of people who have mental health issues, is that our emotions well up and then we're not able to think clearly and make good decisions. And it has, I think, a big part to play in how
Yeah.
society is right now.
Yeah, and I would say that social media, mainstream media, and media publications are all playing into the anxiety to a great extent, because they, you know,
Yes,
the more they can grab our attention, the more they get paid, the more likes and shares they get. So everyone's competing for our attention, and what gets our attention more than fear and anxiety and outrage?
absolutely. Yes. And I
Yeah.
think that this is, I've heard some of the more like centrist YouTube pundits talking about this, but not even enough. Because I think there's kind of like two viewpoints that I hear. One is like, well, I'm fine with bias as long as they say what it is. And I'm fine with provoking fear and anxiety and other emotions as long as I'm doing it with facts. And then the other side is, how can you sleep at night provoking people's mental illness just to get clicks and make money? So
Mm,
I'm a little bit more on that other camp of like, please don't do this to us, because this is just, I mean, so if there is any bias that I do have, it is, I'm trying to make it so people can think as clearly as possible
I hear
about the
that.
scientific knowledge. But yeah, for sure, it's a business model that is very successful. And we don't run ads on SciWorthy. We don't really have that clicks for dollars model. We primarily don't make any money right now, but I do actually have a couple of crowdfunding things going on. We have a locals.com discussion group that is kind of a no holds barred. You can dive in, ask your conspiracy theory questions, ask whatever you want. And there's scientists in there that will hash it out with everyone. And
Okay,
so
I'm gonna
that's
need a
something
link
we
to that.
started.
I'm gonna need a
Yeah.
link
And
to that. I
it's
have some
you,
questions.
yeah, jump on in, jump into the,
Yeah.
it's actually a really affirming community. I love it. It's like the highlight of my week. No one starts fights. There are people who disagree on things, but it never gets ugly. We only have like 35 members right now. And then the way that you financially support is, if you want to get in on the comments and things like that, then you pay like a nominal fee. But if you want to get a free month, there's a coupon code Open Minds that runs until the end of the month. So that gives you like supporter privileges for a month
Okay.
for free.
So,
But yeah, so we do Patreon, we do one-time donations, and we also have a writing course that we
hmm,
sell admission to teach other scientists how to write this way, how to write in a clear, unbiased way that is somewhat different from news writing, although the course does also cover news writing and op-eds as well.
right. So first of all, I'll tell you that I think it is commendable that you're not only looking for, well, first of all, you're not about clicks at all, but that you're willing to withhold something if it's going to increase the anxiety, because more than anything, you want people to be able to think clearly. And as you said, anxiety affects our ability to think clearly. Is is so not putting ads is just about having it stay purely about the information, about the
Yes.
science. Is the reason you're going with the distributed funding model from many people and not trying to get like a large investor so they don't have influence over what you can publish or not? Or is it you're just not at that stage yet to get a big investor?
Well, the two sort of the two reasons. One is to reduce bias, so, or at least the perception of bias. So in a lot of cases, when you get funding for things, they already know what you're all about up front before they give you the money. So the influence kind of goes the other way. It's not that someone, here's a bunch of money, now print the stuff I want you to print. It doesn't work that way, at least in my world. Cyworthy is a nonprofit. So the way that we are a nonprofit is that we're an initiative of a bigger nonprofit called Blue Marble Space, and it's a science organization. And that organization has a research institute. So that's a lot of the way that we get fed studies to cover is people in our research institute let us know what's kind of hot in their field. And a lot of our writers are graduate students. Actually, all of them are, except one. And they're all senior level and like really well versed in the fields that they write about. So that's kind of like, that's really what we're all about. And because we're a nonprofit, we can get donations. And so we're not really looking for investors because we're not like an LLC. So it's not a for-profit business.
Okay.
That's kind of specific to the United States. I'm not really sure
Mm-hmm.
how that broadly applies in the world, but we're not a corporation. We're a
Right.
non-governmental organization.
And part of the reasoning behind that is so you're not influenced in, so the bias stays minimal.
Yeah.
Would you say that there is a truth issue on both sides of the political spectrum, both the left and the right?
That is such a complicated question. So I think when people say that we're in the post-truth era, I think what they're referring to is just that people have embraced the subjectivity to kind of an unhealthy extent. So subjectivity is a thing, it exists. Lots of things are subjective. But the idea that there is a truth to know, so imagine that you've got a truth bubble here, and that truth may or may not be knowable ultimately by all of us, but we accept that all these experiments we do and all this data that we collect is all looking at that truth from a different perspective. And so the way to get the best picture of what truth probably is to look at as much of that data as you can. And so what has kind of happened in, I don't even know if maybe this is just in the last 5 years, maybe the last 10 years, that truth bubble has just been removed. And so now it's just whatever your perspective is what is true.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an unsettling development that I think is fundamentally anti-science. And Cyworthy, we're kind of shouting in the jungle by doing this project because I can't tell you how many times I get pushback about, well, no one's unbiased. You can't be unbiased. There's no truth. I'm like, okay, I get that no human being is unbiased, but you do the best you can because of that, the fact that there is an objective truth that exists. Whether we can ultimately know it is a question for the philosophers. But when we collect the data, we know that we're all looking at that truth. It's measuring something. We're looking at something. And so
Right.
maybe the experiment was done poorly, but we at least need to look at it to understand if that's an accurate picture or if it has what its likelihood of being accurate
Yeah.
is.
So yeah, I would say it seems like people try to blur the lines between truth and opinion, and
Personal experience, that
yeah,
kind of thing.
but there's a clear distinction between something that is measurable, and if you measure it time and time again, you'll get the same results. Like that's
Right.
obviously in a different category than a subjective feeling. And
Sure.
and there's a difference between, everybody being biased, but it's still not zero sum. So there could be a clear attempt to minimize bias, and then there could be no attempt whatsoever, and those are not in the same category. So I feel like both those notions are just trying to blur the lines to make it all seem like it's all the same when really it's vastly different.
I mean, there are definitely things that are more abhorrent than others, and we as a society have kind of lost the ability to talk about that, unfortunately. But that's kind of, I think, I don't know if I want to say the old way of doing things, but whatever the the pre-post-truth era. So wherever we were before this, where people could talk to each other. And I'm 40, so I grew up. I was a teenager in the 90s. I was a college student in the early 2000s. And I do remember people being much better able to discuss these kinds of things. I had friends from all sides of the political aisle, and we would all fight about things and then go out to dinner afterwards and be friends. Like that was sort of how
Right,
how
right.
those conversations used to go. And we used to be able to collectively get together from all these different perspectives and talk about, okay, well, we at least agree that this is not good, so we should stop doing that. But then here's the areas where it's a little more gray and we can
Yeah.
talk that out. And that has kind of been lost. And so,
That, yeah,
yeah.
that's dying, unfortunately, because I guess two things. Your politics don't determine as much about you as a human being as people make it seem. So
Yeah.
who you vote for doesn't determine if you're kind and compassionate, if you're charitable. As much as both political parties will make it seem like it defines everything about you, it really doesn't.
Mm-mm.
Um, and if we're not going to engage in discourse, what else is left? As if isolating people and yelling at them is going to change their minds, it probably just further radicalizes them. So I'm very concerned with that. It's cool to see
Yeah.
that we're aligned there. You know, the term post-truth, I've been thinking about it lately. I used to use that term, and then I started thinking, when were we in a truth era? But I actually think that we've never quite been in a truth era. I think humans, part of what makes us human is that we believe things that aren't true,
Yeah.
whether it's religion or any other political ideology or
Mm-hmm.
dogma. It's a fiction of sorts. Yuval Harari lays this out very nicely in *Sapiens*, the concept of the imagined order. But
Mm-hmm.
so up until recently, the truth most Americans had was based off what the mainstream media told them, what corporations would market to them on television, and what their government would say. So those are
Yeah.
really three sources of truth that all have extreme bias, right? Government wants control; they want to remain in power, they want to get reelected. That's
Yeah.
not in line with truth. Corporations want to sell you stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
media is sensationalist. They want you to sit and view TV. So I think that we've just never really been like a super truthful species. But I think the difference now, it's possible it's getting worse, but I think now what's clear is that our truths are diverging, and there's two sets of truths. So two people living in the same society, and we did have this with religion, like you could have like a Jew and a Christian living side by side,
Mm-hmm.
but that was kind of less of a conflict because they're not competing over politics, right? They don't need to
Yeah.
engage. You could choose not to engage on religion. You have your faith, I have
Yeah.
mine. But on politics, you're forced to talk about it. And when two people are forced to talk on a topic and they have two completely different versions of reality, it creates some kind of friction, as we're currently seeing. So I think
Yeah.
so it's like the terminology, I would say more so than post-truth would be like we're in a divergent fiction era. Maybe
Yeah,
we could talk about it.
it's polarization, I think, is kind of what you're getting at in a sense. So I have found, so I definitely grew up and kind of came into science from one side of the aisle. And in kind of growing as a person and talking to more people who didn't grow up like me, I'm definitely someone that kind of like, I must get some kind of thrill out of going outside my comfort zone. I love talking to people that I disagree with. I think it's fascinating. And I like hearing what people's conspiracy theories are. And I consider all of them because I take an agnostic approach to everything. I'm like, okay, why is this person thinking this? I like to
Mhm.
know the reasons why people believe things, not necessarily, so anyway, what I've kind of noticed, I guess, with polarization is you get you get the two extremes. And there's something about extremism that by design, you feel this imperative to make other people think what you think, and sort of like the evangelism imperative. And so now we have both sides that have this evangelism imperative. And then there's this huge group in the middle that's like, but we still want to talk about stuff. So the polarization has increased. And I think that's what you're seeing with the divergent truths, is that there's no interest in the extremes to actually speak in the middle about, like, okay, let's like think about why someone that you disagree with may have come to that conclusion. And that's what kind of got me talking to the other side of the aisle about science more. It's like, okay, well, I'm a biologist. I think evolution is a great idea. I am convinced by the evidentiary support for evolution, but why would someone not be? And I don't take the default approach that, oh, well, they're just dumb or they haven't studied enough biology or whatever. I get into like what people's objections are to different things. Same with climate change, same with gender, same with all those issues. I want to know what someone's ethical framework is for coming up with their belief system. And that's where you end up finding a lot of common ground, or you learn something. I think this is another thing that's lacking in science communication, is that scientists are these people that like pontificate from on high. And because we're the experts, we know what the best thing is to do. Well, you don't know what the best thing is to do. You know your field well, and you can convey that to the public. But there's this sort of fear that the public is going to make the wrong decision about the data. And I think society is much too fractured, much too polarized to worry about that. That's a little bit of like the evangelism imperative that I feel really uncomfortable with. So put the information out there, let people make their own decisions, let them know that you respect their intelligence, you respect that whatever they believe makes sense to them, and be willing to go into that conversation and have it be two-way. So even as an expert in a particular discipline, go into the discussion with non-experts in your field, being open to changing it yourself, like being open to having your views be altered a little bit. And maybe you'll think of a new way to study your science from talking to people who have objections to it, even if their objections are not realistic or based on a false understanding of the science. Like, you still learn something. You learn, oh, I didn't realize someone would interpret it that way. That's really interesting. Let me think about that. That's really where I always take that. That's the perspective I take.
You know, you're touching on like fundamentals of discourse and how it should work. And I wish this conversation was as obvious as the sky is blue, the grass is green. Like, I wish
Me too.
I wish we didn't have to have this conversation, but you know, it seems.
I'm not a brilliant thinker here. I feel like I'm saying things that are incredibly obvious, and the fact that this is like noteworthy is actually unsettling, I think, to me. So
it sometimes feels like there's no adults in the room.
It does feel that way.
Yeah.
And I started off my life being quite radical and fundamental in my young adult years. So
tell me about that.
It's not that I don't understand. So when we first met, I think originally we're going to talk about that story of how I went from being a science denier to a researcher. And that is a very long story. And I actually, before we met, like from that time we talked, I tried so many times to write it out, and I was like, yeah, this is going to be a novel. I don't think I could explain this adequately. But I guess in short, I started off in college, I was very, very liberal. I was like a climate activist. I even got paid to do it for a time as an organizer. For a summer, I went door to door, all that good stuff. I was in naturopathic medical school, which is something that I'm somewhat embarrassed to tell my colleagues about, because I completely, I went through a lot during those years, we'll just say that. And I was heavily into the new age holistic health community, and I had health issues myself, but I had a couple of near-death experiences, 2 ICU trips within 2 years from doing all these alternative treatments that were hurting me. And I was so convinced that I needed to do it this way that even when they were hurting me, I was ignoring that until it became like, you have to stop doing this. And so there was a time 10 years ago where I said, you know what? I want to be a researcher. So I started knocking on doors, essentially like sending random emails to professors at the university near where I was living. And one of them gave me a chance. They gave me a part-time job in her lab, and I had enough knowledge from my undergrad because I did nutrition. So I had like basic science courses behind me so that I could get in there and at least be taught things. So she taught me everything that I know that allowed me to go to graduate school, that allowed me to
Wow.
have jobs in science. So um, I'm indebted to her as kind of, she had, amusingly, she was like ultra super second wave feminist. And so we did clash on some of those things. Like I was in the lab working until 8 o'clock on the day before my wedding because I was afraid to tell her I was getting married. So those kinds of things were maybe not the healthiest. But as far as my science mentor goes, she changed my life really. And so
Wow.
after that, I did some teaching at a community college. I got on a peer-reviewed publication, and that changed me in like a philosophical way too, because I didn't realize until I did science how hard doing science actually is, and that a lot of those new age views that I had were super oversimplified, and some
Right.
of them were not even grounded in reality at all and were conspiracy theories. So there was
What's an
that.
example? Like,
I guess the idea that there's all these natural cures that modern medicine is hiding because they want to keep everyone sick. The truth is, it's very hard to study diseases, and progress towards coming up with what causes and what explains diseases is long and arduous and unglamorous and takes hundreds and hundreds of scientists to do. And I really wanted to know, why did I have an autoimmune disease? How do I make myself normal again? I was desperate for this because living with a chronic illness is awful. People judge you, they think you're unreliable, and you are unreliable. Like there was a time in my working life where I could only stand up for 2 to 3 hours a day, and I would have to go home and sleep because I had no energy to work.
wow.
And so modern medicine is what saved me. I had 3 massive surgeries over the course of a year of my life that I was basically just either in the hospital or recovering from surgeries and
Wow.
just kind of trying to function. And then kind of like when that was all over, it was like the birds came out and the sun was shined and I was
Yeah.
able to work. 5 weeks later, I was working full time and just finally being an adult. And I was 30 when that happened. So my life is,
Better late than never. Yeah.
yeah, I had a massive derail. It is a source of a lot of psychological scarring for me that I'm admittedly still working through. But yeah, so I think a lot of my passion for creating Sciworthy came from like, well, what made me decide that science was a valid way to learn things? Well, I had to do it in order to know that, and not everyone is going to have that opportunity. So in making the primary literature accessible, kind of to bring this all back around, that was the closest approximation that I could come up with within my skill set to
Mm,
make it so that like I wanted to be part of the solution in a sense that I wanted to make primary science more accessible so that people can see how it's done. And if they come away from that and they're like, this is not for me, that's fine. I just want someone like me out there who
right.
like
Right.
needed to really understand how science was done, and the only way that they learned about science up until then was from the news or blogs.
Right.
That I wanted there to be some more deeper connection to it. So that was what worked for me. So in a sense, that's kind of what I was hoping for Sciworthy.
I think first of all, I'm happy that your health is better and that you're past the worst of it, and also that you're living proof that this evolution can occur. I consider myself in a similar category. I wrote a book when I was a book quotations when I was 14. It's like 60 page. It's one side of paper, so it's like really 30 pages, and it's like size
Right.
16 font, double space.
A mini
Um,
book.
yeah, it was called Weinreb's Way: My Views of Politics as a Teen.
Nice.
I'm embarrassed by almost
It's all right. I
every,
have written those
every
things
word.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Now,
we have all. I was in third grade and I wrote a book, and it was
okay,
not a
okay.
book. You know, I hear
Um,
you.
I want to. I'm interested in the naturopathic versus Western or modern medicine for a
Mm,
few reasons. So, would you say that there's any reason to be concerned with the business model of pharmaceutical companies? I don't
mm,
I don't view it as some conspiracy, but it seems like a pharmaceutical company would rather give you something that would mask the symptoms that you would need to continue to take than something that would cure it. So it seems like the business model just isn't going to look for the cure as much as it's going to look to mask the symptom.
So I'm not an expert in this, but I'll at least give you my opinion, however uninformed it may be. So drug development is incredibly inefficient. So what is done is that there are synthetic organic chemists that are employed by these companies that just make molecules all day long. And the vast majority of them will never become drugs. But they'll take like, I'm going to just use antidepressants as an example. So like the core molecule of Lexapro, add a little thing on it or change the functional group in some way or change the sidedness of the functional group. And then you get another drug called Celexa and you try that one. And so it's kind of like you just make molecules, you're just throwing darts at the wall to see what sticks. And I've wondered for a long time why they do it that way, because then you get things like, well, we have this drug and we know it works, but we don't really know how it works. And like, how can you design a molecule for the body and not understand how it works? Well, that's how. It's just this rapid, like synthetic organic chemistry dart game. And it's inefficient, but that may very well be the most cost-effective way to develop drugs. I'm not in that business, so I don't know that for sure. But whoever does their books has possibly figured out this is the truth. So
Right, but it's also a question of what they're deciding to release to the market. Like, let's say they have something that they discovered a molecule, and again, I'm speculating basically what would seem to be the best business model, and I know that's how corporations function, right? It's about profit, not about human well-being, which is, I think, one of the greatest challenges we have, that those who have the most power don't care much about how we're doing. They care about how much money they gain. Those two things are not aligned.
I think there's a big difference too between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. So those are two different universes. So
True.
If I was going to be skeptical of one entity of modern medicine, it would probably be drug companies if I had to pick
more
one.
So than doctors.
You're right that profit motive does kind of muddy the waters for figuring out what is good for people. However, if there was a molecule discovered that actually had massive repercussions in a good way for health, like if there was really a cure for something discovered that was major, I just find it hard to believe that all these pharmaceutical scientists are so corrupt that nobody would blow the whistle about that eventually.
I hear what you're saying. That's fair. I agree with you that if there is a problem, it's more so at the pharmaceutical companies, but I think that there is a problem in Western medicine, and it might just come down to how they're trained or that they're looking for a quick fix for people. But I think they're way over prescribing certain substances that they shouldn't be prescribing, perhaps at all, or definitely not to the extent they're prescribing it. So I went to the doctor 2 weeks ago. I don't sleep so well. Like when I'm smoking weed, when I'm in a phases when I smoke weed, I could get a full 8 hours. I'm a little bit groggy in the morning, so it's a full 8 hours, but I'm not the most rested. But when I'm sober, and I do long extended periods when I'm completely sober, I don't sleep nearly as well. I wake up in the middle of the night, I toss and turn, I sometimes wake up early. So I went to the doctor to try to understand if there's a way to help with this. And he started off all right, asked me about lifestyle, things I do that may, affect my sleep. And he's like, okay, I'm going to write you a prescription. And, I'm not interested in being prescribed something to go to sleep every night. It just doesn't seem like, a good idea. So I said, is it something natural or is it a chemical? He goes, well, everything comes from nature. Now that's such a sketchy answer because, there's like echinacea and then there's heroin. It's not the same. But so when he said that, I said, no, look, so there's plants and then there's Xanax. He said, yeah, it's in the Xanax family. So it was a lorazepam, something like that. It's a benzodiazepam. That is an extremely addicting drug that once you're
Hmm.
on it for long enough, you're most likely not going to get off of it. The
Hmm.
withdrawals are brutal, they
Yeah.
could take months to years to get off of, and they could kill you.
Yes, no, benzos are dangerous for sure. There's a lot of mental health
Yeah.
providers that are against prescribing them for that reason. And, there's, yeah, I agree
This is
with
for
you on
minor
that.
sleep issues. Like,
Yeah, no,
it's
I
like,
think
bro,
so.
I called
So
him out.
not
I said,
all,
you can't be prescribing that to people with sleep issues. Like, that's unacceptable.
yeah,
Like, I told him, I said, that's not cool. So I
yeah.
think there is
Well, so
a,
not all doctors are equally talented.
for
So
sure,
that
for
is
sure.
that's
Yeah.
a big factor. So when I was looking for medical care through my life, I was living in like small towns. So when you go to a college, a lot of Big Ten or Big Ten land grant universities in the United States are in small towns because they were originally put there to benefit agriculture. That's what that means. And so a lot of major state schools are in small towns. So if there was no medical school in the town, I was kind of stuck with these sort of small town medical practices, and it was real hit or miss, like how dedicated the different medical providers are at following the literature and thinking like a scientist, because not all doctors think like scientists. And I think that was definitely a surprise to me when I went in. They're like medical engineers in a lot of cases, they're practitioners. So that it's apply, apply, apply. And every so often you meet a doctor who has like an investigative mind when you say, okay, well, I have this issue and I don't know what's going on. Not all of them are going to really dig in and be creative with exploring what is going on. And that can be very frustrating for
Mm,
patients, and why a lot of people go to natural medicine, because they have the
right.
veneer of doing that. It's just that unfortunately all the methods they use for doing that are not evidence based, and they're like kind of magical, and not, they violate the laws of physics in a lot of ways. So it can lead people astray for many different reasons. I found so much better help when I went to university teaching hospitals, because they are medical providers that have PhDs and have that investigative mind. And so you can have an intelligent conversation with one of those doctors about what your issues are. And this is just my
Hmm.
personal experience. I don't have like literature to back this up. This is just
Right.
from being a sick person for 12 years and figuring out kind of what the best way was to approach my
Right.
issues. And so I will drive 2 hours to go to a teaching hospital so I can have an intelligent conversation with somebody. Now, that's
Mm,
not to say that the doctors in small towns are all not intelligent. It's just less likely that you're going to find someone with that scientific approach. So
yeah.
that was where I kind of had the toss up. And so, yeah, you shouldn't be prescribing benzos for sleep issues,
Yeah.
but some doctors will do that
I need
because,
I need a new
yeah,
doctor. Essentially, I need a new doctor. Yeah.
yeah, I think you might. That's
Yeah.
probably not a good
I
thing.
think I will also write him a letter
Mm,
explaining how grave a concern like I have over what he's doing, because the, it, I would say that he's even ruining people's lives. He's getting people addicted to a harmful substance for things they do not need.
mhm.
So whatever, I took that personally, that almost personally affected. I almost, the fact that I have a history with partying, and I've even lost a few friends to substance abuse. So it's my experience with substances that gave me the knowledge to know to reject that. So
Yeah.
I'm thankful for that experience. Many people would say, yeah, doctor knows best. Sure, let me take it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so I guess I have like more of a like a 30,000 foot view of the medical, those kinds of problems too.
Right.
So there are a lot of people. There are lots and lots of people, and there are a lot of sick people, and there are never enough doctors. And so doctors have patients coming through very quickly.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so being able to spend the time to investigate and carefully like pick apart all, there are not that many doctors who have the time or even energy to do that like one after another. My
Yeah.
doctor told me that, so she's just my GP, like general practitioner, that she doesn't drink water until the end of the day, because if she drinks water during the day, she will have to go to the bathroom too much, and that slows down her ability to get through all the patients in a timely way.
Mm.
So she drinks all her water at the end of the day and then has to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. But that is her life, that's the way that she has managed how many patients she has to see every day. And so if you have a doctor that's kind of like, okay, here's your prescription, it's unfortunately a side effect of there being so many sick people and not enough ways to care
Right,
for them. It's
right.
just where we're at
That's
with medical science. We haven't solved all the problems yet. So I think that if doctors had the option to not cover up symptoms with drugs, that they would happily take them, but we don't have all those options available
yeah,
yet. And there may be, so with the natural thing, that's like naturalistic fallacy, the idea that something that comes from nature is inherently better than something
yeah,
man-made. And so it's really more of a spectrum of like how close to the original source it is. So like a Xanax is a pure chemical. That's a purified compound, but the plant that that molecule came from may have lots of other chemicals in it. So when you use an herbal treatment, it's really like, I'm going to take a handful of mystery pills and see what works. And maybe the
right.
one that works is in there somewhere, or maybe
Hmm.
there's an interaction effect, or there's some combination of things in there that's actually helping me. And that is actually what pharmaceutical science does try to figure out. So it's just very slow. I think that maybe people
I hear that.
have a like an impatience, which is understandable. As someone who was chronically ill for my whole young adulthood, that impatience is something that I deeply understand. Like if I did not
Mm,
have to have three
right.
surgeries to remove an organ, I would have liked that. So, but we do what we can. And now I'm not saying that, okay, medicine's perfect. We should not criticize it, because we should criticize it. But I guess there's lots of different ways to explain these things, that not all of them have like nefarious implications, I guess.
I hear that. I hear that. I would, yeah, I agree. I would say if there's a problem with pharmaceuticals, the pharmaceutical company, it could be a result of misaligned incentives. They look for profit. We just
Hmm.
want increased well-being. Doctors, I just would view it more as an issue of like lack of knowledge and information to make the best decision, lack of resources. That's something that I hope we can solve soon through like algorithmic, we'll just have like AI doctors, or at least they'll help. Like I'll be able to input all my information into a computer, and then they'll be able to give me like the best approach to how to deal with sleep issues based off everything they know about me. And
Yeah, big
computers are going to be able,
data.
they're going to be able to do that much better than doctors.
It's possible. I mean, right now there are even tools available for testing combinations of drugs in silico to determine, for example, like which antibiotics are going to interact and have a beneficial effect or
Mm,
not. So there's definitely,
cool.
and I'm not an expert in these things. I actually only know about this because I tutored a college student in biology who had to read one of these papers, and I had to help her figure out what it said. So it was new to me too when I looked at it. But there are definitely like what they call high throughput, so ways of doing multiple comparisons more than any one human being could do, high throughput drug discovery methods that use computational methods. So yeah,
Right.
it's possible that we could learn, our learning goes exponentially as time goes
I'm
on.
I'm I'm
So
I'm looking forward to that. Is there anything in the field of naturopathic medicine that is effective and worthwhile that you've
I'm
discovered?
probably an imperfect candidate to talk about naturopath school because I had such a terrible experience with it. But
Okay,
I think that most of the things that they recommend that are science based are not unique to naturopathy. They're like good nutrition and exercise. Those are things that are kind
true.
of like they
I'm thinking
existed
more in
already
terms
outside of
of
that worldview.
like something like acupuncture. Like that concept fascinates me. It,
Yeah, I don't know enough about it to comment. I the people I do know who look into that more have told me that meta-analyses of the research on acupuncture is negative, so that it doesn't actually do
okay.
anything, but that people do benefit from
The
attention from another person. And I think in some ways the
oxytocin
rapid,
release,
yeah, the rapid
relaxation,
throughput
right? Yeah.
of modern medicine makes it so that people crave
Mm,
attention. And so having an hour-long session where someone is really caring about you and paying attention to your needs and asking you questions and making you feel like they're really trying to figure out what's wrong. And in many cases, those practitioners are definitely, they are caring and they really want to figure it
yeah.
out. So that is I think a lot of the benefit that people get, I mean, that was a benefit that I got, except when it didn't work. And then they would say, well, there was something wrong with you. You did it wrong. And that's why it didn't work. That's like a
Right.
Kafka trap. Like, oh, it didn't work because you didn't think it was going to. And then that's where it
Well,
turns toxic.
but
So,
right, and they're almost actually hinting at what about it works. So like on one hand, there's the attention you get from somebody. There's the physical touch, which we know releases oxytocin, right?
mhm,
I've done acupuncture and it seems to be effective, but I realize it might be there might be other reasons. It might not be the needles themselves. It's the fact
mhm.
that you're relaxing for an hour with music on.
Yep.
Somebody's touching you, and we know
Yep.
placebo to be effective. So what they're hinting at is saying, oh, it's because you didn't believe it would work. Essentially, what
Mhm.
they're saying is it's just placebo. You need to believe in it. If you believe in it enough, then it will work.
And what does it mean to work is another question. So does
True.
it make is it improvements in subjective measures, or is it actually changing some kind of molecular process in your body? We actually are covering a study about placebos soon. It's due for editing on January 25th. So sometime at the end of the month, early February, we'll have an article on the site about a new finding related to
Oh,
placebo that is actually pretty interesting. So
I'd
I
like
won't
to see
spoil
that.
it, but yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I,
So
I,
it'll be cool.
yeah. Placebo is interesting because it does bring up the question. Maybe this study is going to show something different, but I remember reading that it's effective in 70% of the times. I don't know what exactly they're measuring, but it seems to be effective. So if believing something works is effective, there's almost a benefit to believing things that aren't true, right? If you could give somebody a sugar pill and it will cure their headache, maybe that's better than taking Motrin long
Hmm.
term. So there's a trade-off, right? One is they're getting a very natural cure to a problem, but it's at the expense of them believing something not true. What
Hmm.
is it net positive? It's hard for me to
Yeah,
determine.
it's
Yeah,
an
I'm not
it's
quite
an
sure.
a tricky ethical conversation to have about whether deception is an ethical way to do medicine. And
Right.
that's something that a lot of people in that field discuss at length. So it is
Mm,
definitely being talked about as,
okay.
and it's important in the psychology profession, psychiatry, all those things. So yeah, there are people who talk about these things. I think they don't get much viral attention on the internet. So again, bringing it back around to Cyworthy, shameless plug. Um,
Plug it.
having a way to get people to engage with the primary literature as directly as they possibly can without being an expert and without having a journal subscription. That's how we really find out about these things. Is like, what is it that the scientists are talking about? It's not necessarily the same thing that the journalists are talking about.
It generally isn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I want to touch on one more topic before we wrap up. Are you
Cool.
familiar with evolutionary biologist and now thought leader Brett Weinstein?
I do listen to his Dark Horse podcast occasionally, and I remember his crazy story when his.
With the telomeres in the mice, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. I haven't followed that particular part of it that well,
You
but
were
I
talking
did.
about what happened to him at Evergreen University.
Yeah, no, I know what you're referring to though with the like the contention over his graduate advisor claiming a discovery that he was part of or ignoring something he said about mouse telomeres. Was that what it
Yeah,
is?
he discovered he yeah, they discovered that mice have very long telomeres. And again, I'm not a biologist, I might mess some of this up. Telomere is something on the gene level. They're very long in mice. And he discovered that it's not that mice have long telomeres, it's that lab mice have long telomeres. And because they're not going through a natural evolutionary process, it's actually changing the length of their telomeres. And
Hmm.
this is very problematic because if you're using mice for scientific research, but they're not, their genetics are fundamentally different, like the telomere is different, then you're not going to get the right results using those mice. But he made this discovery. He was able to prove it, and the discovery was kind of pushed under the rug. And he suspects because there might be an entire industry around these lab mice.
Hmm.
So what I was going to say is, if that would be like a story, if Cyworthy covers that, that could help. That could be like a viral story, because Brett Weinstein will share it to his millions of or hundreds of thousands of
Mm,
followers. I don't know if it fits exactly what you're doing, but I thought it could be an interesting
yeah.
idea.
So what I would have to do. So we have a section on our site called Throwback Thursdays that was started by one of
Saw
our
that.
writers, which is an idea that I think is really fun. So because our study, like our regular article summarizing protocol is like 2 years or newer. Throwback lets the time frame be into as far back into the past as we want. So we'll
Mm,
summarize a paper from the 1700s. So
cool.
he found a scientific study when oxygen was discovered, like the atom or the, I guess, molecular oxygen, and just, so when oxygen was discovered. So he summarized that, because this Justin, he's one of our like MVPs. He actually speaks French, and so the original stuff was in French, and so he like dug into this, and it was really like the coolest thing ever. So we could probably take that paper from Brett Weinstein's advisor and summarize that. But I think what is different about Cyworthy is that we don't actually do stories on topics. So I wouldn't necessarily be pulling a bunch of resources and explaining like
Right. It would just
that.
be his study.
Yeah, and so it
Right.
allows, like, ideally what we would do is we would summarize all of the studies involved in that controversy and let the readers read them all and then piece it together on their own.
Right.
That would be the approach. Now, whether we would actually be able to do that, I would need a writing team that's much bigger than the one I have to get every study that's ever been done. We'll never do it. There's too many studies. There's even a study about how there's too many studies that came out a couple of years ago. So
Interesting.
it's that bad. Like, there's millions and millions of papers. We could never get to them all.
Right.
But I think the thing with that, if I remember what I picked up from, and I have not read enough about the Brett Weinstein story in this regard to know for sure, but what I thought the response was that he was a graduate student who was kind of making an observation that he thought was critical, but that the advisor said, oh, well, this is a known phenomenon in mouse research. And so it's taken into account that when we're comparing mouse studies, that at least relative to from one study to the other, you can see effects, but whether those effects are generalizable to humans, there's a lot more layers of complexity to figure that out anyway, telomeres only being one of them.
Mm,
So that it was a discovery that is important and known, but it was not particularly like groundbreaking.
okay.
It wasn't a new thing that no one knew before. So that may have been a misunderstanding between Brett and his advisor, but then again, I don't know either of them personally.
Interesting.
Take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. I'm willing to be corrected on this, but that was
Yeah,
just my read of it. So
quite possible. If you do decide to break down that study, I give you my word that I'll take it and then tweet at him until he sees it, and then
okay, sure. Why not? I mean, it is always interesting when people with big Twitter followings tweet Cyworthy, because then I get
right.
all this attention and I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? But no, it's actually fine. Like, if you find a paper that you would like us to cover, you can send me that DOI and we'll get it through our journal
Okay.
access and then cover it. So that is something that anyone who's listening, anyone that you know, if there's a paper that you find and you're like, I really want to know what this is saying, but I do not understand any of these words, that's like perfect for us. Send us the paper, we'll cover it. It might take us a while to get to it, but we'll do it.
Awesome. Um,
info@cyworthy.com. That's the
yeah,
email you
and
send it to.
I will put the website and whatever relevant links in the description for anybody to see. Any final thoughts you want to share with our audience?
Um, I guess we covered so many things and I'm kind of drawing a blank, but I think what I would really like to see is a renewed interest in non-emotional content, which I realize is a tall order because we are emotional beings and we are attracted to things that make us feel stuff rather than
Right.
things that make us think stuff. But if you are a curious person and you're the weirdo in your friend group that can't seem to stop asking why, and you've been called a conspiracy theorist for asking very reasonable scientific questions, you should join our locals community because you will find your people there. There are conservative scientists, liberal scientists, there are non-political scientists. I'm like right in the center politically. After doing this work, I've definitely become like, I don't know what my political views are anymore, but there are non-scientists in there. We actually want the non-scientists to kind of drive the conversation. So it's sciworthy.locals.com. So that's kind of my new thing right now, is getting the two-way conversation going. And this locals platform has made that possible for us finally. So we've tried so many different ways to reach readers, and this is the first way that's actually stuck. So
Well, your mission is truly commendable, and you have a new supporter. So it's been a great pleasure speaking to you, Gina. Thank you.
thank you for having me. This is a great idea for a podcast, and I hope it takes off more and you get lots of cool guests. You should interview Weinstein. That would be cool.
I'm working on it. So far, the biggest name I've had was Noam Chomsky. He's
Oh,
been
that's amazing.
yeah. So you get to put your name next to his essentially in being on the
Yeah.
podcast. He's actually coming back next month for a debate, because we do live stream debates. But Brett is one of the people I'd like to speak to the most. It's just I don't think the channel's big enough yet. A lot of the bigger players don't respond to my emails yet, but I have a feeling if you publish that paper and then he sees that I helped initiate it, then I'll
All
be
right, all right.
like,
Well, yeah, let me know. I'll
so you
look
see what
for
I
it and
did
I'll
there while I
see.
was pressuring that. Like it was it was for my own self-interest why I brought that up. But
Okay. I mean, I am interested in that, and I think if that's something people want to know about, I will try to dig up that paper for a throwback month or something and see if I can find it. So sounds good to me.
awesome.
Yeah, okay.
Thank
Well,
you,
thank you
Gina.
for having me.
For sure.